And if you can take this precious 1 minute whilst I ask for the third speaker before us and coffee break. Garry Jacobs. You're on. Do you have a PowerPoint that I should load? No, how wonderfully refreshing. Nothing against the PowerPoints, but it's my great aim not to be able to give a talk without PowerPoint.
I thought we've had plenty of PowerPoints and...
Okay, thank you. I will let you know when 20 minutes have gone by and then...
You make it 15?
15. I will flash at 15.
7, 5, whatever.
Okay, 15.
Good afternoon. First, I really have to genuinely and not formally thank Olivia and Marta for inviting me here. This is the second time. First time was in Lundsberg about 18, 20 months ago. And that was a very enjoyable experience for me and a learning experience. But this time I already come away with something more than that, a certain sense of anticipation. That's where we met the first time at a first conference on anticipation in Trento, or hope or aspiration. I really want to thank all of you who are involved with this INTREPID project and sincerely hope that this is only the beginning, because what you're doing is so important not just to universities, but so important to the world. And I'm not saying that to flatter anybody, I'm saying it because I believe it very, very deeply. And so many of the things that I believe in and so many of the things that I'm working on have been mentioned by speakers here today. I would need my notes in order to properly attribute, and I don't think that's the best way I can do it. And so I threw away my presentation. I threw away my notes from the morning session also. And I decided in a very self-centered way that the best way I could communicate to you is not through a lot more abstract ideas, but from what Paolo just said about experience. Because my own coming here has come from what I learned from experience rather than what I learned in an academic atmosphere. And my whole work is, my whole quest has been how to get that experience and that knowledge into the educational system so people don't have to do the crazy things that I did in order to get it. And I think that's what you're about. And I would like to do anything I can to encourage you and even to help and collaborate with you, but I'll come to that. Since we have two sessions, one by speaking and the other one as a panel, I'd like to focus on the knowledge dimension of the future of the university now, and under the panel talk more about the university itself. Pardon me for being personal, but I think it'll communicate more effectively, and my only excuse for this is I went for 45 years addressing academic audiences around the world on different things without ever saying a single thing about myself. And nobody understood where I was coming from. So full disclosure, you can completely ignore anything I say because I don't have a PhD. Wait, I'm getting better. I've never worked in a university. In fact, I never worked in a corporation either, though I'm a management consultant and I've done consulting for a lot of them. My story is simple. I made accidentally, if there are any accidents in the world, I enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley in September of 1964, which happened to be the month of the free speech movement, probably before most of you were born, which was the first campus protest in the United States, started against a protest about how the university was being managed. And from there, it went to the Vietnam War and gay rights and feminist rights and everything else, free love and drugs and everything else in the world, and then spread all over the US, and in 4 years, it was all over the world. And when I went to Prague, the first time I went behind the Iron Curtain in August, end of July 1968, I went to Prague and I found a place that looked like Berkeley. They were all sitting on the streets in blue jeans, long hair, with guitars, singing songs and everything. And I said, this is great. And then I left and drove to Berlin, and a week later I read in the paper that the Soviet tanks had come in. And this Prague Spring was over in a day. The most interesting thing I ever learned when I was at what we call Cal was not from any of my classes. It was from somebody, anybody know the name Eric Hoffer? Eric Hoffer was a product of the 60s. He was read in every university in the United States at least. He was a longshoreman who went blind when he was 8 and stopped his education from that age, taught himself, later regained his sight, taught himself to read and write, worked among the people of the United States, among the working class, and wrote a book called The True Believer and another book called The Ordeal of Change, which became bestsellers for all university, for sociology, for political science, and anything related to society. And I had Berkeley, the university paid him to come at the age of, he must have been 68 or 70 by that time, and simply sit in an office 2 days a week in the afternoon and talk to anybody who wanted to talk to him. And I was lucky enough to find out about it and went and talked to him, and I found just listening to him was more interesting than anything I learned in the classes. And it was so stimulating, he asked me to think. He asked me not to listen and memorize what he said, he asked me to think, and I'm very grateful for it. I decided after trying architecture, I never had an architecture class, but I was enrolled in architecture, that I would be most interested in understanding about myself. So I became a psychology major. And with due deference for any of you who have completed that course, I graduated in psychology, but I honestly never learned anything about myself. And I was so egocentric, so selfish, I wanted to know myself, not about the theories. I learned all the theories and got straight A's, but I never learned anything about myself. And that turned out to be a very important lesson, which I'm grateful for. So it's a long story. The quick version is under pressure from my family, I went into medical school so I could become a psychiatrist. And after 1 month, I dropped out because I realized this is not what I want to do. And I spent 2 years just reading everything I hadn't read during my formal education, undergraduate education, looking for something that was more relevant to me. And I had no idea what that is or would be, so I tried everything. I tried philosophy, Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy. I tried literature. I tried religion. I tried astrology. That was the time. You know, we were all crazy at that time. We would try the Kabbalah and the I Ching and everything else. And at the end of 2 years, and I read all the collective works of Carl Jung and really loved it and was intrigued by it, but I still wasn't sure that I found it. So finally, after 2 years, I gave in. I surrendered to the pressures of family, and I decided to go back to medical school. And I convinced the medical school that I was worth risking a second time. And then I made the mistake of going into a bookstore in Berkeley where a book from the top shelf fell down and hit me on the lap. And just out of a superstition, I took it home. And out of a coincidence, if there are any coincidences in life, because it's the first time I met Chris was a couple of days ago, and the fact that he's been in South India and knew or read or studied Sri Aurobindo is totally unplanned. But anyway, this book was a book about Sri Aurobindo. And my wife and I got married. 10 days later, went on a hippie honeymoon in the mountains. She took this book with her. She said, I think you really want to read this book. A year later, I dropped out of medical school second time. We went over to India and did this impossible thing that nobody who knew me would think I would do. We joined a spiritual community and lived there, gave up everything that we had. And my message was that I began to learn everything that I wanted that I didn't know existed. And I learned more about people. I learned more about myself. And one of the things I wish somebody had told me earlier was, because we started reading literature, started reading Shakespeare, started reading English literature, and I found out if you really want to understand people, read literature, don't read psychology. If you want to practice, you probably need to study the psychology. But if you want to understand people and society, read psychology, literature. Spent about 4 or 5 years studying Shakespeare, writing papers, talking to Shakespearean critics, reading all the famous people, and then other literature as well. And I still do it, by the way, because I'm still learning from it. And then I met a very, very wise man who doesn't like to be talked about at all, so I'll just say he. And he started talking to me about business management. And I said, I have not come to India to talk about business management. My father was a successful businessman, a wealthy businessman. It's because of that I have come to India, because I don't want any of that. He said, you're an idiot. He said, you obviously haven't understood anything Sri Aurobindo said if after 3 years you still think that business has nothing to do with you or life. Business is only a form and way of life. And he started, the first thing he said was, the real principle of business management is that the outer expresses the inner. That the performance of a business reflects the attitudes and consciousness of the founders and leaders of the business, and the success of a business reflects how far it is in tune with the society it's a part of. So his second principle was that business is a child of the society. And from there we went on and on. Short story was 10 years later, I wrote a book on business management, wrote it in India, have never worked in a corporation, but we went into big companies like Apple and Intel and DuPont and IBM and Merck and other Coca-Cola and things like that to get examples for the book. But the entire ideas in the book had come from what I learned at an ashram in South India. And I did a good job of disguising that so nobody would be turned off by it. And Peter Drucker, some of you may know, he was really the father of modern management. He was given the book by my co-author, and he wrote a preface for the book and said, this book is filled with profound insight, indeed wisdom. And he had absolutely no idea that the wisdom came from anything but North America. And I know that for sure because about 3 years later I wrote him a letter and he says that's all nonsense. The book he appreciated when he thought it was written by two guys who went into companies in North America. When he found out the origins were different, that's not possible. So what I'm trying to say is that what was wrong for me with the course in psychology was we got the abstraction of knowledge, not the experience that the psychologist had. The great psychologists who met hundreds of thousands of people and studied human behavior have tried to communicate that to us. And they have done it the same way we're trying to do here by drawing diagrams or creating abstract formulas so we can pass it on. It didn't work for me. I got the formulas, I got the concepts, I could define what each of them meant, but I didn't get their experience. And later I found out that's the problem not only in psychology, but that's the problem at least in all of the social sciences. And then after working on management or parallel with management and literature, we started working on social development. And if you think I wasn't interested in management, I was much less interested in the social development of a country that was very poor. I was not one of these dedicated people who went to India to transform it and make it prosperous. At least I didn't think I was. But when I understood To understand my own country, to understand the world, I must be able to understand what's going on in India. And we started studying that process. And the organization I was working with started a development project that, the short story is, it spread all over India to 100,000 villages, creating prosperity in them. And the question for us was why? Why, when so many development programs fail, why did this one succeed? What can we learn from that? And we studied it, and then we started coming up with strategies that could be applied in other areas in India, and ended up giving recommendations to the government in Delhi. And finally, in 1980, we prepared a report for the Planning Commission, 137 projects or programs on how to accelerate the development of the country, but not based on any theory. That was 15 already. Not based on any theory in a textbook, based on the principles we could derive from our experience. And we formulated a theory of social development. And I only found out this. I went to conferences around the world talking about the theory of social development and found nobody's interested in that because they know it's impossible. It's impossible to have an integrated theory of development. We went and I met the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, and the first program in that report, she said, we're going to do this. The next day she addressed a national audience, and within a month or 2 months, it was a program of the government. 10 years later, we did a report on how to create full employment in India. And we first went around to all the economic institutions and say, you know, what are your ideas to create full employment in India? Said, that's not our subject. Well, you must have ideas. No, how can anybody create full employment in India? We're talking about 100 million jobs, which is what the US created in a century. Where's the question? They weren't even asking the question. So we asked a question, came up with a strategy, and the result was it was accepted by the government and became formal policy within 3 months, which was something we never anticipated possible. I'm sorry for talking about myself because that's really irrelevant, except to say that what I want to say to you is born out of an experience that there is a knowledge in the world that the world needs. As a result of that work, I was very improbably nominated and elected to an organization called the World Academy of Art and Science, founded in 1960 by very eminent intellectuals like Einstein, Bertrand Russell, Robert Oppenheimer for the Manhattan Project, and many, many others. Buckminster Fuller was a fellow, Margaret Mead, and so forth and so on, previously, of course. And gradually I worked myself up to become a member of the board, and most improbably of all, since 2011, I'm the chief executive officer, and I was chairman of the board. Don't they know that I'm completely unqualified for this? I mean, this was an organization with Nobel laureates, with rectors and presidents of universities, with deans. Most everybody had a PhD, not everybody, but most everybody, and why they allowed this. But every idea that I wanted to work on the academy met a very rich, positive reception. As long as I didn't say this is coming from India and this is based on Indian spirituality and make a mistake like that. I never made that mistake so far in the academy. I may be making it with you today. Anyway, now I want to come to the issue with 3 minutes left maybe, right? Under the academy, our program is we are studying. This academy was not set up in the typical disciplinary way. A World Academy of Art and Science with no departments, where every problem was looked at and is looked at from a trans or interdisciplinary or whatever word you want to use perspective, because we feel that every perspective from the arts, the humanities, the sciences, and other professions has a valid contribution to make to this. And most importantly, this was set up by people who had been responsible, who saw the power of science and knew that they have to be responsible. The scientists could no longer step back and say, we just think and somebody else acts and we're not responsible for it. This was set up by people who said, we have to take responsibility for the knowledge we create and its application, and we have to speak up. So science is responsible. And what's it responsible for? Not just that things work, but that what we do improves, advances human welfare, advances peace, welfare, and well-being of humanity. And there's nothing else that members of the Academy are asked to be really concerned about, is what we do must advance human welfare. So we've been working on global challenges, which Olivia mentioned in the very beginning of her talk this morning, that education has something to do with our future. And what could be more important than that? We've got the problems of security, we've got the problems of ecology, we've got the problems of economy and rising inequality and unemployment, we've got the problems of technology dissemination and its impact, and what the consequences will be. And we came to some conclusions about that. We came to the conclusions that there is no solution to the global challenges confronting humanity today that can be applied by any nation by itself. It has to be done globally. Not just climate change, not just technology, not just employment. They are all problems of global dimension, but we don't have global governance to handle that. We came to the conclusion that none of them can be effectively addressed through existing policy framework and existing institutions. We came to the conclusion that none of them can be effectively addressed through the existing educational system. And we came to the conclusion that none of them can be addressed through the existing theoretical framework. So if I was going to speak for another hour or two, I would talk about, we have an international working group on new economic theory, and we came up with a really interesting name for that. It's human-centered economy. Well, what a silly idea. What else could economy be for except for human beings? But when you go and read the theory, you'll see that economy exists for itself. Financial markets exist for themselves. Economic growth exists for itself, unrelated to a very large extent, not exclusively to the rest of society. We're partnering with IEEE, Paula's friends, I'm sure, the largest professional organization of electronic and electrical engineers, who are working on cognitive computing and AI in Milan, by the way, where you're from. And all their technology, they've accepted that we're going to have a second stream. They're talking about technology. We're going to talk about the social consequences and implications of technology on human beings. And they've agreed that at least we can do it in the same forum. But that also implies that in the education of our technology people, that social responsibility and social implication is not what's being taught. It's only the technology itself. And I can go on whether we're talking about law and governance or society or obviously ecology. So when you say here, and you as a group come together and say, we need interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, by whatever that means to the group, we say absolutely yes, because none of these things can be solved through a disciplinary perspective. None of these problems. What could be more important for us? What could be more important for educational institutions to do than to address those problems? They can't be done not only through disciplinary boundaries, but I would say they can't be done by people who come together from different disciplines to exchange ideas. We need theory that's transdisciplinary, that's integrated. We need conceptions of how economy works, society works, government works, that are really integrated, that are based on an integrated knowledge. And that's the kind of work we've been trying to do in the academy. And then, how many minutes left? 5. Great, it's a lot of time. And I said there was one more thing we concluded, that none of these theories are possible, or this education is possible, as long as we insist on using the narrow, one particular capacity of the human mind, which doesn't exhaust our capacities at all. Mainly our capacity for analysis, which is to divide things into pieces and look at each piece as if it's a whole reality in itself, and that's how we get, by last count, more than 1,000 disciplines and subdisciplines, at least in the United States. I don't know how many you have here. We divide reality into so many different parts. I don't know about you. I have a hard time dividing myself into pieces and keeping them as separate things. We are whole. Our social existence is whole. Our personality is whole, but we are schizophrenically divided, and our minds and our concepts are divided in that way. And so systems theory came along to help us aggregate all of these pieces that so we can look at least things in an aggregate whole and piece them together. And that's a different way of thinking, which is fortunately getting a lot more attention and importance now than it was in previous decades. But it still doesn't give us the whole. It doesn't give us the perception of the real reality. It doesn't explain to us what peace is. Peace is not just the absence of war. It doesn't explain to us what health is. Health is not just the absence of disease. It doesn't explain to us what well-being is, or love, or most of the things that are most important to us. So our educational system, we believe, can and should also be helping us to learn other ways of thinking, which is fully possible, which we do in our moments of inspiration, but which the system is not reinforcing. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I'm definitely abandoning PowerPoint, and then I have to practice a lot. Thank you. Thank you all 3 speakers. You've been amazing. I don't want to say anything now that might sound wise, because A, you need to have a coffee break. B, I wouldn't be able to say anything, add anything useful to what has been said. I hope you agree that you have now been given 3 amazing stories. By non-chance, they were aligned like this, and they worked very well. We will have a final speaker just after coffee break, and then finally we'll get into conversation. But I feel that I hope this will just stay with us. We can go for coffee break. We can also not have to have long conversations with each other and take 15 minutes of pause and reflection. That would be a great exercise for those who feel like it. And I will ask you to come back, please, at past, if that's okay. So we will have 20 minutes. And I want to thank the 3 speakers. Thank you so much for the tremendous work.
I don't know if you have ever heard of the efforts of several people are doing to make ecocide a crime and to change international law. And there's especially one person, she was formerly a barrister, but she devoted her life, or she's devoting her life to change international law, and she's called Polly Higgins. And she has, for example, for the great, no, she's not here. She has also done a great TED Talk, The Great Turning. We heard today about these things. So I just would like to leave you with the name Polly Higgins and her work to make ecocide a law. The reason why I want to speak today about her is that last week she was diagnosed with cancer, and she's only given 6 weeks to live. And her deepest wish is that we all stand up more to protect the earth. So I guess we could all support this work, and eventually this to see how we could speed up this process to make really, she calls it, this is a missing piece, like genocide help that minorities can be protected. We maybe can help that the earth finally gets this protection, and that crimes against the earth can be suited on international law level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.